What would you do if your HOA decided your land was better suited for a shopping center than the home you built with your own hands? No discussion, no negotiation, just a cold letter in the mail telling you that everything you've worked for, every memory rooted in the soil beneath your feet, is about to be bulldozed. That was the moment I realized my fight wasn't just about property, it was about power. I still remember the feeling when I first opened that letter. The words were stiff, emotionless, written in the same bureaucratic tone you'd expect from a past-due utility bill. But the meaning behind them was a gut punch. Your land has been selected as the site for a new shopping center. We expect your full cooperation in moving forward with this community improvement project. That was it. No warning, no request for input, no acknowledgement that this wasn't just some vacant lot waiting for development. This was my farm. My family's history. My entire life. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe a mix-up in the property records. Maybe they had the wrong address. There was no way they could just decide to take my land. I tried to push down the panic rising in my chest, convincing myself that this could be cleared up with a simple phone call. But then my phone rang, and I heard the voice of Karen, the president of the HOA. Her tone was clipped, efficient, and completely devoid of empathy. "We need you to come into the office. There's nothing to discuss. Just sign the paperwork so we can move forward." Something in my gut twisted. They weren't asking. They were demanding. The second I stepped into that office, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary fight. The room was clean, modern, but suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Karen sat behind her oversized desk like a queen holding court, flanked by two other HOA board members who barely acknowledged me when I walked in. They didn't have to. Their faces said everything. They had already won in their minds. Karen folded her hands and smiled, the kind of practiced, artificial smile you see on politicians just before they tell you something awful. "You can't stop us. We're the HOA. We do whatever we want." I felt my jaw tighten, my fists clench at my sides. I thought about my father and grandfather, both of whom had worked this land with their bare hands. I thought about the mornings I'd spent fixing fences, the nights spent tending to livestock, the generations of sweat and sacrifice poured into this soil. And in a single meeting, this woman had dismissed all of it as if it were nothing. Then she slid the papers across the desk. "Sign here," she said, her voice carrying the weight of expectation, as if she had already decided my answer. I took a deep breath, held it for a second, then exhaled slowly. This was my land. My home. And I wasn't about to let them take it. I pushed the papers back toward Karen without a single mark on them. Her smirk faltered for half a second, but she recovered quickly, tilting her head as if I were a misbehaving child who didn't know what was best for him. "You don't want to do this," she said smoothly, folding her hands. "Trust me, Jim. The HOA doesn't take kindly to people standing in the way of progress." I leaned forward just enough to let her know I wasn't intimidated. "You don't want to do this either," I said, my voice even. "Because I'm not going to roll over and let you take what isn't yours." For the first time, her mask slipped. A flash of irritation flickered across her face before she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You'll regret this," she hissed, turning on her heel and storming out, leaving the two board members scrambling to follow. I walked out of that office with my heart pounding, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of what they were trying to pull. I'd lived on that farm my entire life, and not once had I ever signed anything that gave the HOA authority over my land. But as I drove home, doubt crept in. If they were bold enough to make demands without asking, what else were they capable of? That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a strong cup of coffee and started digging. If the HOA wanted a fight, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. I pored over property records, local zoning laws, and every HOA regulation I could get my hands on. And that's when I found it, a trail of corruption so deep, it made my stomach turn. Karen wasn't just pushing this shopping center for the good of the community. She was financially invested in it. The development company leading the project? She had shares in it. The board members backing her decision? All of them had personal ties to the contractors. This wasn't about progress, it was a money grab, plain and simple. The next morning, I drove over to see Earl Simmons, one of the oldest residents in the neighborhood and a man who had seen the HOA pull its tricks for decades. He greeted me on his front porch with a slow nod, as if he'd been expecting this visit. "So they've come for you now, huh?" he said, motioning for me to sit. I told him everything, the letter, the meeting, the threats. Earl listened quietly, sipping his coffee, before setting the mug down with a sigh. "Son," he said, rubbing his chin, "you need to understand something. The HOA ain't just some group of busybodies who want everyone's grass cut to the same height. Once they set their sights on something, they don't stop. They'll threaten you, they'll manipulate you, and if that don't work," he paused, looking me dead in the eye, "they'll break the law to get what they want." I left Earl's place with a new sense of urgency. If what he said was true, I couldn't just defend myself, I had to get ahead of them. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of documentation I could find. Property records, land surveys, legal precedents, anything that proved my farm was mine and not subject to their authority. Then the first real attack came. It started small. A warning notice from the HOA appeared in my mailbox, claiming that my fence was an unauthorized structure and needed to be removed. The problem? My land wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. The next day, I woke up to find my fence had been cut open, my livestock wandering loose near the road. I fixed it, only to have it happen again that night. But this time, I was ready. I set up a camera near the gate, and sure enough, when I checked the footage the next morning, 2 men in dark clothing were seen slipping onto my property with bolt cutters. I couldn't make out their faces, but the way they moved, the hesitation, the constant glances over their shoulders, told me they weren't just vandals. I took the footage straight to the sheriff's department, hoping to file a report. But when I showed it to the deputy, he just sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You're dealing with the HOA, aren't you?" I frowned. "Yeah. How'd you know?" He shook his head. "You wouldn't be the first. And you won't be the last." That night, just as I was about to turn in, I heard the rumble of an engine outside. I walked to my window, expecting to see a stray car passing by. Instead, my stomach dropped. A brand new, "No trespassing, private property" sign had been installed at the entrance to my driveway. And it wasn't mine. I stormed outside, heart pounding, and yanked the sign out of the ground. The metal stake screeched against the dirt as I tossed it onto the side of the road. My land was not private property belonging to the HOA, and they damn well knew it. This was another intimidation tactic, another move to try and make me feel like I was losing control. The next morning, I drove down to the county office to request a full property survey. I needed legal, indisputable proof that my farm was outside HOA jurisdiction, something I could wave in their faces the next time they tried pulling this stunt. While waiting for the documents, I made another stop, this time, at the local news station. I had been hesitant at first, thinking maybe I could fight this battle quietly. But after the vandalized fence, the fake violations, and now this bogus, "No trespassing" claim, I knew the HOA wasn't just playing dirty, they were trying to break me. If they were going to escalate, then so was I. Inside the newsroom, I met Melissa Carter, an investigative reporter known for exposing corrupt local policies. She listened intently as I laid everything out, the letter, the meeting with Karen, the property destruction, even the footage of the men sneaking onto my farm. When I got to the part about Karen's financial ties to the shopping center project, Melissa's eyes narrowed. "You have proof of this?" she asked, leaning forward. I pulled out my folder, flipping through pages of company ownership records, stock transactions, and project contracts. Karen wasn't just supporting the development, she was making money off it. Melissa sat back and exhaled. This is bigger than just your farm. If what you're saying is true, this is corruption at a city level. I could see the wheels turning in her head. She knew a story when she saw one. And I knew that if the HOA wanted to keep their dirty dealings under wraps, they had just made a huge mistake picking a fight with me. Within a week, my story was all over the local news. The segment ran in the evening, featuring footage of my farm, my livestock, my property records, and even the video of the masked men cutting my fence. The piece ended with Melissa confronting Karen outside the HOA office. Karen, caught off guard, flashed her usual fake smile but was clearly rattled. "We're simply following community guidelines," she said, dodging questions about her financial ties. "Mr. Walker is making a bigger deal out of this than necessary." The public wasn't buying it. The fallout was immediate. My phone blew up with calls and messages, neighbors, community members, even total strangers reaching out with their own horror stories about the HOA. People who had been too scared to speak up before suddenly felt emboldened. "I've been fined over $1,000 for a mailbox that was too modern," one message read. "They threatened to put a lien on my house for planting the wrong kind of flowers," another neighbor told me in person. But it wasn't just sympathy that started rolling in, it was anger. The more people talked, the more a pattern of HOA corruption surfaced. Then, the retaliation hit. 2 days after the news aired, a certified letter from the HOA landed in my mailbox, far more aggressive than before. This time, they weren't just trying to intimidate me, they were threatening legal action. The letter claimed that I was disrupting community peace, and that my public hostility toward the HOA was creating an unsafe environment for residents. They demanded that I remove my illegal fence, grant access to my land for community development, and cease all public statements against them, or face a lawsuit. I laughed when I read it. This wasn't a legal document, it was a desperate attempt to scare me into silence. They knew they were losing control. I drove straight to my lawyer's office, letter in hand. He scanned the paper, then smirked and tossed it onto his desk. "They've got nothing. This is pure bluff." But Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, I was standing on my porch with a cup of coffee when a white SUV pulled up my driveway. I didn't recognize it at first, until the two figures stepped out. Karen. And a Child Protective Services officer. My stomach twisted into knots. I had heard about HOAs playing dirty, but this was another level. The CPS officer, a woman with a professional but weary expression, approached me. "We received an anonymous complaint about unsafe living conditions on your property," she said. I barely heard the rest. My blood was boiling as I shot a glare at Karen, who stood with her arms crossed, watching with a satisfied smirk. I didn't even have kids. But my sister's 2 young children visited sometimes, and I knew exactly what Karen was trying to pull. She was hoping CPS would find something, anything, that could be twisted into a reason to shut me down. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You're welcome to look around," I said to the officer, stepping aside. "You won't find anything." Karen's smug look flickered slightly. The officer did a full inspection, walked the property, checked the barns, even looked inside my house. When she was done, she sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "I see no evidence of neglect or unsafe conditions here," she said, snapping her clipboard shut. "This complaint appears to be unfounded." Karen's lips thinned. The officer turned to her, her professional demeanor cracking just a bit. "And next time," she said sharply, "I suggest you make sure there's an actual issue before wasting our time." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the officer was already walking back to her car. I stood in silence as she drove away, then turned back to Karen. "You really tried to get CPS involved? You're that desperate?" I asked, my voice low. Karen smoothed her blouse, regaining her composure. "We all have to look out for the safety of our community," she said with a sickeningly sweet tone. I stepped forward, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She turned on her heel and left without another word. That night, I made one more call, to a national investigative journalist. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, I was about to show them just how badly they had underestimated me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling in the distance. At first, I thought maybe one of my neighbors was working on their property, but as I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. A bulldozer sat at the edge of my farm, its massive metal blade poised just feet from my fence. A construction crew stood around it, waiting for orders. And then, standing right beside them, clipboard in hand, was Karen. I marched straight over, my blood boiling. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I barked, stepping in front of the bulldozer. Karen barely looked up from her clipboard. "We're beginning preliminary work on the site," she said, flipping a page. "Your land has been designated for redevelopment. You have no legal right to touch my property, and you know it," I shot back. "I never agreed to this. There is no sale, no contract, no authority that allows you to do this." Karen smiled that same smug, condescending smile. "Well," she said, "there's been a change in the paperwork." My heart pounded. A change? That could only mean one thing: they had forged documents. I pulled out my phone and immediately dialed my lawyer. "I need you down here now," I said as soon as he picked up. Karen sighed, making a show of looking at her watch. "We have a schedule to keep, Jim. If you insist on delaying progress, we'll have no choice but to escalate matters legally." I clenched my fists. They were trying to bulldoze my land before I could stop them. Minutes later, my lawyer arrived, screeching to a halt on the dirt road. He stormed over, snatching the clipboard from Karen's hands before she could stop him. He scanned the documents, his face darkening. "This is fraudulent," he said coldly. "If you so much as put a scratch on this property, I will personally see to it that you and every single one of these contractors are sued into oblivion." Karen's expression faltered, just for a second. Then, she forced a tight smile. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said smoothly, motioning for the construction crew to stand down. "We'll revisit this at a later time." I watched as the bulldozer backed away, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Karen lingered for a moment before finally turning and walking back to her car. But I knew this wasn't over. She had just tried to steal my land in broad daylight. If she was willing to go this far, then she was desperate. And desperate people did stupid things. That night, I barely slept. The events of the day played over and over in my head. The forged paperwork. The construction crew. Karen's smug certainty that she could get away with it. I had to hit back, and I had to do it now. The next morning, I made a call to a national investigative journalist. Not just a local news reporter, but someone with the reach to make this story go viral. The minute I explained the situation, I could hear the excitement in their voice. This wasn't just about an HOA overstepping its bounds, this was corruption at the highest level, an abuse of power that could set a precedent for homeowners everywhere. And then, just as I was finalizing the details of the interview, my phone rang again. It was the sheriff's department. I answered, my stomach tightening. "Mr. Walker," the voice on the other end said, "we received a complaint from the HOA regarding a potential threat you made toward one of their board members. We need you to come down to the station for questioning." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Karen was trying to have me arrested. I drove down to the station, already knowing exactly how this was going to go. As I walked in, the deputy behind the desk gave me a sympathetic look. "I'll be honest," he said, shaking his head. "This whole thing stinks. But we have to follow protocol." I sat through 30 minutes of questioning before they finally let me go. There was no evidence, no actual complaint beyond Karen's word, but that didn't matter. The goal wasn't to get me arrested. The goal was to rattle me, to make me second-guess my next move. But what Karen didn't realize was that she had just made her final mistake. By the time I got home, my phone was blowing up. The journalist I had spoken to had already done a deep dive into the HOA's financials, uncovering years of fraud and embezzlement. Karen and her board members had been quietly funneling HOA fees into personal vacations, luxury cars, and offshore accounts. Then the national news picked up the story. Within hours, my phone was flooded with calls. Activists, lawyers, other homeowners from all over the country who had been bullied by HOAs just like mine. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time since this all started, I saw real panic from Karen's camp. By the end of the week, I got word that several HOA board members had resigned. The community was turning against Karen, and she was losing control. But I wasn't finished yet. I pushed harder. I contacted property rights organizations, legal firms specializing in HOA abuse, and even elected officials who had been vocal about corrupt homeowners associations. And then, the final blow came. Karen's own HOA members turned against her. At the next meeting, a vote was called for her removal. Residents who had once feared her now stood up, demanding answers. They wanted to know where their money had gone, why she had targeted me, and how deep the corruption ran. Karen tried to defend herself, but it was useless. The people who once supported her now saw her for exactly what she was, a power-hungry fraud. She was officially voted out. I found out through the news later that night. She had been forced to step down, and her involvement in the shopping center project was under legal scrutiny. And just like that, the war was over. I stepped outside onto my porch that evening, looking out over my land. My land. Still standing. Still mine. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace. A few weeks after the dust had settled, I stood at the edge of my farm, looking out over the fields as the sun dipped below the horizon. The land was quiet again, untouched, just as it had always been. No bulldozers, no HOA goons skulking around in the dark, no letters stuffed into my mailbox with thinly veiled threats. The fight was over, and I had won. But the victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to every homeowner who had ever been bullied, manipulated, or steamrolled by people like Karen and the corrupt system she represented. The HOA had officially dropped all claims to my land, and in a final act of desperation, they sent me a settlement offer to resolve any misunderstandings. It was their pathetic way of trying to save face, but I took the deal anyway, not because I trusted them, but because it legally forced them to admit they had overstepped. My lawyer made sure every last loophole was closed. My farm was protected for good. As for Karen? Well, she disappeared. No farewell speech. No apology. One day, her house was on the market, and by the end of the month, she was gone. The rumor around town was that she had tried to worm her way onto another HOA board in a different neighborhood, but word of her corruption had spread too far. Nobody wanted her anywhere near a position of power again. The woman who once thought she was untouchable had become a cautionary tale. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little satisfaction in that. Not just because she had lost, but because she had done it to herself. Her greed, her arrogance, her complete disregard for other people, it all came back to bite her. In the months that followed, life returned to normal, but something had changed. People around town treated me differently. Neighbors I barely spoke to before would stop by just to shake my hand or thank me for standing up to the HOA. Some shared their own horror stories of being pushed around by power-hungry board members. Others simply wanted to know how to fight back. I never set out to be some kind of hero. All I wanted was to protect my home. But in the end, my fight had meant something bigger. It had shown people that they didn't have to bow down to authority when that authority was corrupt. That when you stand your ground, when you refuse to be intimidated, you can win. Now, every time I walk past the gate, the one they tried to tear down, I smile. Because it's still standing. Because my farm is still mine. And because no HOA, no Karen, no corrupt system is ever going to take it from me. So tell me, have you ever had to fight back against an HOA or a power-hungry Karen? How far did they go? Let's hear your stories. I have a feeling I'm not the only one who's been through this kind of war.